The last normal thing I remember that night was complaining about the coffee being burnt. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the dark realizing something smarter than us was watching. And one of us wasn't going to make it home. I've kept quiet about what really happened that night because admitting it means admitting I didn't save my partner. The official report says animal attack, but I know what killed him. And I've been carrying that knowledge alone ever since. My name isn't important. I'm not looking for attention, and I'm not trying to convince anyone who's already decided this kind of thing isn't real. I was 39 years old at the time, working armed private security in South Carolina, mostly overnight contracts that nobody else wanted. Empty properties, abandoned facilities, places far enough from town that response times were long and help was never guaranteed. I took those jobs because they paid better, and because after years as a corrections officer, quiet nights didn't bother me. I liked routine. I liked knowing what to expect. That night, in late November, I was assigned to a contract on the outskirts of the Francis Marion National Forest, not far from Highway 17. The site itself was an old utility substation tied to a decommissioned rail spur, surrounded by chain-link fencing and pine woods that went on for miles. Copper theft had been an issue a few months earlier, which was the only reason they paid for armed guards at all. Otherwise, it was the kind of place people forgot existed. I wasn't alone. My partner that shift was a guy named Mark. He was a few years older than me, early 40s, former National Guard, solid and dependable. We'd worked together maybe half a dozen times before. Not friends exactly, but the kind of work acquaintance you trust with your back turned. He had a dry sense of humor and a habit of humming when things got quiet. That night, he was the one driving. We stopped at a gas station just outside McClellanville before heading out, the kind of place with flickering fluorescent lights and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting there since morning. I took one sip and said something about it being burnt and stale. Mark laughed and said it would do the job anyway. That was the last thing that felt normal. By the time we reached the site, it was just after 11. The air was cold but damp, the kind that seeps through your jacket instead of biting. A thin fog clung low to the ground, drifting in slow sheets between the trees. Pine needles crunched under our boots as we walked the initial perimeter, flashlights sweeping the fence line, radios crackling softly with static. Everything checked out. No broken locks, no vehicles, no footprints that didn't belong to us. We settled into the routine. One of us stayed near the truck while the other did short walks along the fence, switching every half hour. The forest around us was alive at first. Crickets, distant frogs from the swampy lowlands, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. I remember thinking it was almost peaceful, in a lonely way. Sometime around midnight, that changed. I can't tell you the exact minute, because nothing dramatic announced it. There was no sound that made me jump, no sudden movement. It was more like someone slowly turning down the volume on the world. The insects stopped first. One moment they were there, and the next there was nothing but the wind in the trees. Even that seemed muted, like it was being swallowed by the fog. Hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I remember feeling annoyed at myself for noticing. Working nights messes with your head. You start imagining patterns where there aren't any. I told myself it was just the temperature dropping, or the fog rolling in thicker. Mark noticed it too. He didn't say anything at first, just stopped humming. When I looked over at him, he had his head tilted slightly, listening. "You hear that?" he asked quietly. "Hear what?" I said, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "That's the thing," he replied. "I don't hear anything." We stood there for a moment, flashlights off, letting our eyes adjust. The darkness felt heavier without the background noise. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, twice, then went silent. Not fading into the distance, just stopping, like someone had cut it off mid-sound. My blood ran cold, and I tasted something metallic at the back of my tongue. I tried to laugh it off, said it was probably a coyote or someone's hunting dog. Mark nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He keyed his radio and did a routine check-in with dispatch. Static answered back, louder than usual, then nothing. He tried again. Same result. "Probably the fog," I said, more to myself than to him. That's when the smell hit us. At first it was faint, easy to ignore. A wet, musky odor, like a dog that hadn't been washed in years. Under that was something sharper, almost like old pennies or rust. It didn't belong out there. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between normal rot and something wrong. This felt wrong, unnatural, and it made my stomach tighten. "Do you smell that?" Mark asked. Before I could answer, there was a sound from the far side of the fence. Not loud, but deliberate. A slow scraping, metal on metal, like something heavy brushing against the chain link. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the flashlight steady as I turned toward it. The beam cut through the fog, catching nothing but fence and trees beyond. "Probably a deer," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they sounded thin. "Deer don't scrape like that. And they don't make the ground feel like it's vibrating under your boots." We stood there, listening, every instinct screaming at me to run even though my brain was still trying to catch up. Somewhere in the dark, something shifted its weight. Not fleeing. Not charging. Just moving, slow and confident, like it knew exactly where we were. That was the moment I realized the shift wasn't normal nerves or imagination. Whatever was out there wasn't reacting to us the way animals do. It wasn't afraid. And as the silence closed in around us, I understood, with a clarity that still haunts me, that we were no longer alone on that site. And that understanding came just seconds before everything went wrong. By the time the scraping sound stopped, the silence felt heavier than before, like the air itself was pressing in on us. I remember glancing at Mark and seeing the same question on his face that I felt in my gut. Do we leave, or do we pretend this is nothing? Neither of us said it out loud. We were professionals, and professionals don't panic over a feeling. We did what training and habit told us to do. We started moving. Mark took the fence line to the east, I went west, staying within sight of each other. Our flashlights cut narrow tunnels through the fog, the beams reflecting off wet pine needles and patches of sand. Every step sounded too loud in my ears. Gravel crunching under my boots seemed to echo, even though I knew it wasn't. The forest stayed unnaturally quiet, no insects, no birds settling for the night. It felt like the land was holding its breath. About 50 yards down the fence, I noticed the smell again, stronger now. Wet dog, copper, and something else I couldn't place, sour and stale, like meat left out too long. It made my nose wrinkle and my stomach roll. I lifted my sleeve and breathed through the fabric, trying not to gag. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. A dead hog. A dumped carcass. Something like that. That's when I saw the fence. One section of the chain link wasn't torn open, but it was bowed inward, the metal stretched and bent like someone had leaned into it with their whole weight. The top rail was scuffed, the galvanized coating scraped away to bare steel. I crouched down and ran my fingers along it. The metal was still cold, but the sand beneath showed disturbed patches, deep impressions pressed into the ground. They weren't boot prints. They were too long, and the spacing between them didn't make sense. Whatever made them hadn't walked like a person, but it hadn't dropped to all fours either. I remember thinking they looked more like elongated ovals, with impressions at the front that could have been claws. My blood ran cold as I stood back up. "Mark," I called quietly into the radio. Static hissed back, loud enough to make me flinch. I tried again, switching channels. Nothing. I pulled my phone out and checked the screen. No signal. Not even a flicker of bars. I was about to turn around and head back toward the truck when I heard it. A sound came from deeper in the trees, low and resonant, almost felt more than heard. It wasn't a growl exactly, not the way dogs growl. This was deeper, steadier, like something testing its voice. The vibration rolled through the ground and into my legs. I couldn't move, frozen in place, my flashlight beam wavering as my hands shook. "Did you hear that?" Mark's voice crackled suddenly through my radio, faint but clear enough to understand. "Yeah," I whispered back. "What the hell was that?" There was a pause. Too long. Then he said, "That didn't sound like any animal I know." Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to the truck and leave the site, contract be damned. But another part of me, the part trained to assess threats and not abandon a post without cause, kept me rooted. I told myself it could still be a bear, even though bears weren't known to move like that around here. I told myself fear was making it sound worse than it was. We regrouped near the truck, standing close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The fog had thickened, turning the floodlights around the substation into hazy halos. Shadows pooled between the trees, shifting when the wind moved the branches. I felt exposed standing there, like we were on a stage with the audience hidden in the dark. Mark broke the silence. "Let's do one more sweep," he said. If we don't see anything, we call it and sit tight until morning. I nodded, even though my stomach twisted at the idea of going back out there. We moved together this time, weapons unholstered but pointed down, flashlights scanning low and high. That's when we heard the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and slow. Not the quick, erratic movement of a deer or raccoon. Each step sounded like weight being carefully placed, testing the ground. The sound moved parallel to us, just beyond the reach of our lights. When we stopped, it stopped. When we took a step, it took one too. Time seemed to slow down. My breathing sounded loud in my ears, shallow and fast. I could taste bile at the back of my throat. I remember thinking, this thing is pacing us. The thought felt unreal, like something from a movie, but there it was, unfolding in real time. "Hey!" Mark shouted suddenly, his voice sharp and loud. "Who's out there?" The sound died instantly. No footsteps. No movement. Just that crushing silence again. I swung my flashlight toward where I thought the sound had come from, the beam catching the trunks of pine trees and low brush. For a split second, I thought I saw something taller than the others, a darker shape that didn't match the trees. Then it was gone, swallowed by shadow. We stood there, weapons up now, fingers tight on the grips. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the sight steady. I wasn't thinking about protocols or radio calls anymore. I was thinking about how small we were out there, how easy it would be for something to rush us from the dark. Another sound came then, closer than before. A sharp exhale, almost a huff, followed by that same low vibration. It felt wrong, unnatural, like the sound didn't belong in any animal's chest. The smell hit us again at the same time, thick and overpowering. Mark swore under his breath. "That's it," he said. "We're not alone." He turned back toward the truck, motioning for me to follow. We moved fast but controlled, not running yet, not wanting to trigger whatever was out there. As we reached the edge of the clearing, something moved off to our right, fast enough that I only caught a blur of motion. It was too tall. Way too tall. That was the moment the last normal explanation shattered. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was watching us. And as we reached the truck, fumbling with the doors, I knew with a certainty that made my chest ache that it wasn't going to let us leave without showing itself. And that was when things escalated beyond anything I could pretend to understand. By the time we reached the truck, my nerves were stretched so tight I felt like one loud sound would snap them clean in half. Mark unlocked the doors, and we both climbed in without a word, slamming them shut harder than necessary. The interior light flicked on for a second, making the fog outside glow white, then clicked off again. I hated that moment of brightness. It felt like we'd just announced exactly where we were. Mark turned the key. The engine cranked once, slow and reluctant, then caught. The sound was loud in the stillness, too loud. I remember thinking that if something was out there, we'd just given it a beacon. Mark kept the headlights off at first, just the parking lights, letting the engine idle. We both sat there, listening, breathing hard, trying to decide our next move. "Let's roll out," I said quietly. "Call it in from the highway." Mark nodded and put the truck in drive. That's when something hit the side of the vehicle. Not a crash, not a ram. More like a heavy shove, right into the passenger side door, hard enough to rock the truck on its suspension. The impact made a deep, hollow thud that I felt through the seat and up my spine. My hands flew to the dash, and I couldn't stop myself from shouting. Mark stomped the brake. What the hell was that? Before I could answer, something scraped along the side of the truck. Metal groaned softly, a slow drag that made my teeth ache. I turned my head toward the passenger window, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. The glass fogged with my breath, and for a second I couldn't see anything beyond it. Then a shape moved past the window. It was too close to make out clearly, just a blur of dark mass sliding by, but it was tall. The top of it passed above the window frame, blocking what little light there was. As it moved, the smell flooded the cab, thick and suffocating. Wet fur. Copper. Rot. I gagged and fumbled to roll the window up even though it was already closed. "Drive," I said, my voice barely working. "Mark, drive." Instead of accelerating, Mark flipped on the headlights. The beams cut through the fog, illuminating the clearing in front of us. For half a second, there was nothing there. Then something moved at the edge of the light, just outside the beam, pacing us again. It stayed where we could sense it but not quite see it, like it knew exactly how far the light reached. That's when the radio crackled to life. Not dispatch. Not words. Just a burst of static followed by a sound that made my stomach drop. It was a low, distorted noise that almost sounded like breathing, too slow and deep to be human. Mark stared at the radio like it had betrayed him. "No," he muttered. "That's not right." The footsteps started again, heavier now, circling the truck. I could feel them through the floor, each step sending a faint vibration up my legs. The headlights caught glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows that didn't match the branches swaying in the wind. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. We were sealed inside a thin metal shell, surrounded by something that clearly wasn't afraid of us. Mark reached for his door handle. "I'm getting out," he said. "What?" I snapped, turning toward him. "No. Don't do that." "We can't just sit here," he replied. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the fear underneath it. "If it's a person, we need to show we're armed. If it's an animal, we scare it off." I wanted to argue, to grab his arm and stop him, but before I could say anything, the sound came again. That deep, resonant growl rolled out of the darkness, closer than before. It wasn't loud, not really, but it carried a weight to it that made my chest feel tight. My blood ran cold, and I realized my hands were shaking so bad I could barely unclasp my seatbelt. Mark hesitated, then pushed the door open. Cold air and fog rushed into the cab, carrying that awful smell with it. Mark stepped out, his flashlight and weapon up, scanning the tree line. I slid across the seat, half out the door myself, not willing to let him face whatever this was alone. "Hey!" Mark shouted, his voice echoing weakly. "We see you. Back off." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fog to our left shifted, and something stepped into the edge of the headlights. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It tried to fit the shape into something familiar. A bear. A man in a costume. A trick of light and shadow. But none of those explanations held. The thing stood upright, taller than the truck's roof, its head brushing the lower branches of the pines. It didn't rush us. It didn't snarl or bare its teeth. It just stood there, partially in the light, partially swallowed by shadow, like it wanted us to see enough to understand how outmatched we were. Time seemed to slow down. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and irregular. The world narrowed to that shape in front of us. My mouth went dry, and there was a bitter taste on my tongue, like I'd bitten down on a penny. It took one step forward. The movement was smooth and controlled, not clumsy or animalistic. The long legs bent the wrong way for a person, joints moving with an efficiency that made my skin crawl. Its shoulders rolled slightly as it shifted its weight, muscles moving under dark, matted fur. The headlights caught the curve of its chest and the length of its arms, which hung too low, hands ending in shapes that weren't paws. "Jesus," Mark breathed. The thing tilted its head, just a little, like it was listening. Then it took another step, closing the distance with terrifying ease. That was when Mark fired. The shot cracked through the night, painfully loud. The muzzle flash lit up the clearing, burning the image of the creature into my eyes. For that instant, I saw more than I wanted to. The elongated snout. The glint of eyes reflecting the light. The size of it compared to us. I've never felt fear like that before or since. The bullet didn't drop it. It didn't even slow it down. The creature lunged, moving faster than anything that big should be able to move. Mark tried to backpedal, shouting something I couldn't make out. I was frozen in place, my body refusing to obey my mind, watching as the distance between them vanished. The last thing I remember before everything dissolved into chaos was the sound. Not a growl this time, but a deep, explosive roar that seemed to tear out of its chest and rip through the air. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just hunting. It was deciding. The roar seemed to tear the night open. It wasn't just loud, it had weight to it, like pressure, like something you felt in your bones more than your ears. My legs finally unlocked, not because I chose to move, but because my body reacted on its own. I stumbled backward against the open truck door, nearly falling, my shoulder slamming into the frame hard enough to knock the breath out of me. The creature stepped fully into the headlights. There was no more fog hiding it now. No more shadows to soften the shape. It stood upright, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times, trying to measure it against the truck, the fence, the trees. 8 feet feels conservative. When it straightened its back, its head rose higher than the roof of the cab, shoulders broad enough that it looked like it could block the road if it wanted to. Its body was massive, built like something designed for power rather than speed, but it clearly had both. The chest was deep and wide, muscles shifting under a thick coat of dark fur that looked black in the shadows and muddy brown where the light hit it directly. The fur wasn't sleek or healthy looking. It was coarse, clumped in places, like it had been living rough for a long time. Some patches looked matted, almost greasy, especially around the shoulders and neck. The head was wrong. That was the first word that came to mind. Wrong. It was canine, no doubt about that, but stretched out longer than any wolf or dog I'd ever seen. The snout was elongated, heavy, with flared nostrils that twitched as it drew in the air. Its mouth was slightly open, and even without baring its teeth, I could see them, long, thick, yellowed points that looked more like tools than just teeth. Its eyes locked onto us, and that was when my blood ran cold. They were a yellow-amber color, reflecting the headlights like an animal's, but there was intelligence there. Not instinct. Not confusion. It wasn't startled by the gunshot. It wasn't angry. It was focused. Studying. I had the overwhelming sense that it was looking at us the way a person looks at a piece of equipment, deciding how to use it or break it. The arms hung low, far longer than a human's, muscles thick and defined. When it moved its hands, I saw fingers, not paws. Long, jointed fingers ending in black claws that curved slightly, catching the light as it flexed them. Those hands curled and uncurled slowly, almost lazily, like it knew it didn't need to rush. Mark stood frozen a few feet in front of it, his weapon still raised, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I could see the way his shoulders were tensed, the way his knees bent slightly like he was bracing for impact. He shouted again, something desperate and angry, but the words were lost in the ringing in my ears. The creature tilted its head, just a few degrees to the side. That small movement terrified me more than the roar. It was a gesture of curiosity. Of assessment. It felt wrong, unnatural, like a human mannerism worn on a monster's body. Time seemed to slow down. I remember noticing stupid details, like the way the headlights made steam rise from the fog around its legs, or how the pine needles near its feet trembled with each shift of its weight. My mouth was so dry my tongue stuck to the roof of it. There was a bitter, metallic taste flooding my senses, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep my grip on the truck door. Mark fired again. This time the shot was aimed higher. The crack of the gun echoed, and I saw a small burst of fur ripple on the creature's shoulder as the round struck. It reacted, but not the way anything normal would. It didn't cry out. It didn't stumble. It didn't fall. It stepped forward. The movement was shockingly fast. One moment it was standing there, the next it closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Its legs bent and straightened in a way that wasn't quite human, joints working with an efficiency that made my stomach drop. The ground seemed to vibrate as it moved, the weight of it thudding into the earth. Mark tried to backpedal, firing again, but he was already too close. I saw the creature's arms swing, not wildly, not in a frenzy, but with deliberate force. The clawed hand struck Mark across the chest and shoulder, lifting him off his feet like he weighed nothing. The sound he made wasn't a scream. It was a sharp, shocked exhale, the kind someone makes when all the air is punched out of them at once. He hit the ground hard, skidding across the dirt. His weapon clattered away into the darkness. I wanted to move. I wanted to run to him, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my body refusing to obey, every instinct screaming at me to run even as my eyes stayed locked on what was happening. The creature loomed over Mark, its massive frame blocking the headlights. It leaned down, and for a horrifying second, I thought it was going to bite him. Instead, it reached out with one of those long hands and grabbed him by the leg. The claws dug in, tearing through fabric like paper. Mark screamed then. A raw, panicked sound that cut straight through me. The creature dragged him, slow and effortless, toward the tree line. Mark clawed at the ground, fingers digging into dirt and pine needles, leaving shallow grooves behind him. I could hear his boots scraping, his breath coming in ragged bursts. I finally found my voice and shouted his name, the sound cracking and useless in the night. The creature stopped at the edge of the light. It turned its head and looked at me. That eye contact will haunt me for the rest of my life. There was no rage in its expression. No frenzy. Just awareness. Calculation. I knew, in that moment, that it was making a choice. It could come for me next. I was right there, helpless, exposed. Instead, it held my gaze for a long, terrible second, as if committing me to memory. Then it dragged Mark into the darkness. The forest swallowed them both. The fog closed in, and the headlights illuminated nothing but empty ground and shaking branches. Mark's screams cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, tearing sound that turned my stomach inside out. I retched, while burning my throat, barely managing to lean far enough out of the truck to avoid vomiting inside. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds. Minutes. Time didn't work right anymore. I remember the smell lingering, thick and suffocating, and the sound of something moving deeper in the woods, heavy footsteps fading away. When the silence finally returned, it was worse than before. I realized then that I was alone. Truly alone. And whatever had taken Mark hadn't chased me, hadn't rushed the truck, hadn't finished the job. It had let me live. That thought terrified me more than anything else that night. I don't remember deciding to move. I just remember suddenly realizing I was breathing again, shallow and fast, like I'd been underwater too long. My hands were still locked around the edge of the truck door, fingers numb, knuckles white. When I finally looked down, I saw they were smeared with dirt and a thin line of blood where I'd scraped them without noticing. The headlights were still on, washing the empty clearing in harsh light. Mark was gone. The place where he'd fallen was torn up, the ground scarred with drag marks leading straight into the trees. Pine needles were scattered everywhere, mixed with dark patches that I didn't want to look at too closely. The smell hung in the air, heavy and sickening, like wet fur and iron. I forced myself into the driver's seat. My legs felt weak, like they might fold if I stood too long. I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though I knew how pointless that was. The interior of the truck felt suddenly very small, like a thin shell separating me from something that could peel it open if it wanted to. My heart was pounding so hard I could see my pulse jumping in my hands. I put the truck in gear and pressed the accelerator. Nothing happened. The engine revved, tires spinning uselessly for a second before the traction control kicked in. I realized then that in my panic, Mark must have driven us partially off the packed gravel and into the soft sand near the tree line. The rear end was sunk just enough to trap us. A sob threatened to break out of me, sharp and humiliating, and I had to clamp my jaw shut to keep it in. Think, I muttered aloud, my voice shaking. Just think. I rocked the truck gently, shifting from drive to reverse, trying not to dig the tires in deeper. Each movement felt too loud, every engine sound like an invitation. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me. Nothing moved. The forest was still again, like it had been before, like nothing had happened. That scared me more than if it had been roaring. The truck lurched suddenly as the tires caught. I didn't waste the chance. I hit the gas harder than I should have, feeling the vehicle shudder as it clawed its way back onto solid ground. Gravel sprayed behind me, pinging off the undercarriage. I didn't slow down. I turned the wheel and pointed us toward the access road, toward anything that wasn't those trees. As I drove, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the truck straight. My vision tunneled, the edges darkening. I kept swallowing, trying to get rid of the bile creeping up my throat. Every shadow looked like movement. Every reflection in the mirrors made my heart jump. I didn't look back. The access road was a narrow strip of gravel winding through the pines, barely wide enough for one vehicle. The fog was thicker there, clinging low and swirling in the headlights. I drove too fast, tires skidding on loose stones, knowing that if I wrecked, there would be no one to help me. The radio was still dead. My phone still showed no signal. I was completely on my own. Halfway down the road, the truck jolted hard, like I'd hit something solid. I shouted in surprise, jerking the wheel before forcing myself to steady it. I slowed just enough to glance in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a dark shape standing in the road behind me, tall and motionless, watching the truck pull away. Then the fog swallowed everything, and there was nothing but swirling white and darkness. I don't know if it was really there or if my mind filled in the image on its own. I don't know which possibility scares me more. When I finally reached Highway 17, the sight of asphalt and reflective paint nearly broke me. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped, hands still locked on the steering wheel. My chest tightened, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to a single point, and I doubled over, gasping, my forehead pressed against the wheel as a wave of panic crashed over me. I don't remember how long I sat there. Long enough for the adrenaline to wear off and leave me shaking and hollow. Long enough for the guilt to creep in. I was alive. Mark wasn't. That thought hit me harder than anything else. I replayed the moment over and over in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. If I'd grabbed him. If I'd fired sooner. If I'd forced him back into the truck. Every version ended the same way, with him being dragged into the dark while I stood there frozen. When I finally called 911, my voice didn't sound like my own. I remember struggling to form sentences, words tumbling over each other as I tried to explain where I was and what had happened. I didn't say Dogman. I didn't say creature. I said there had been an attack. I said my partner was taken. I said I didn't know by what. Law enforcement arrived faster than I expected. Red and blue lights cut through the fog, flashing against the trees. An officer guided me out of the truck and made me sit on the bumper, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders even though I wasn't cold. I noticed then that my pants were torn and smeared with dirt, that my hands were scratched and bleeding in places. I hadn't felt any of it. They asked me questions. Simple ones at first. Where were we stationed? What time did this happen? Had we seen any animals? I answered as best I could, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the clearing, to the way the creature had looked at me before disappearing into the woods. A search team went out at first light. They found the drag marks. They found the disturbed ground. They found pieces of Mark's gear scattered near the tree line. But they didn't find him. Not that day. Not the next. When they finally recovered what was left days later, it was far enough into the forest that I knew, without anyone saying it out loud, that whatever had taken him lived out there. I went home after giving my statement, but home didn't feel real anymore. Every sound made me jump. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow eyes staring back at me, calm and calculating. I knew then that my life had split in two that night. Before the woods went silent. And after. The days that followed blurred together in a way that still feels unreal when I think back on it. Sleep came in short, broken stretches, if it came at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that clearing, watching Mark get dragged away while I stood there useless and frozen. I'd wake up soaked in sweat, heart racing, convinced for a few seconds that I could still smell that wet, copper stink in my bedroom. Law enforcement contacted me again the next morning. They wanted me to walk them through the site in daylight. Part of me wanted to refuse, to never set foot near those woods again, but another part felt like I owed Mark that much. So I went. In the daylight, the place looked smaller. Less threatening. That almost made it worse. The fog was gone, burned off by a pale winter sun, and the pine forest looked like any other stretch of South Carolina woods. Birds were back, hopping between branches, chirping like nothing had happened. The normalcy felt wrong, like a lie. They showed me where they'd found the tracks. Seeing them in full light made my stomach drop. The impressions were massive, sunk deep into the sandy soil. Each print was longer than my boot, wide at the ball, narrowing toward the heel, with clear claw marks pressed into the front. The stride between them was too long for a human, even running. I crouched next to one and held my hand over it, and my palm didn't come close to covering it. One of the deputies said it was probably a bear that had reared up. He said it casually, like he was trying to reassure himself as much as me. I nodded, but inside, something twisted. Bears don't leave prints like that. Bears don't walk like that. And bears don't drag grown men off the way Mark had been dragged. They photographed everything. The ground. The fence. The side of the truck. That was the first time I noticed the claw marks. 3 deep gouges ran along the passenger side door, cutting through the paint and into the metal beneath. They weren't random scratches. They were parallel, evenly spaced, and angled slightly downward, like something tall had reached out and dragged its claws along the side as it passed. I ran my fingers near them without touching, feeling a chill crawl up my arm. I asked one of the officers if he'd ever seen damage like that before. He avoided my eyes and said animals can do surprising things when they are threatened. Mark's body was found 2 days later. They didn't let me see much. Just enough to confirm what I already knew. The injuries were described as extensive, inconsistent with a typical animal attack. There were no clear bite patterns that matched dogs or bears. The coroner used careful language, the kind meant to sound definitive without actually saying anything concrete. Cause of death: trauma due to animal encounter. Animal. That word followed me everywhere after that. At the station, during my formal statement, I stuck to the facts. I talked about the silence, the sounds, the attack. I didn't describe the creature the way I'd seen it. I said large and upright and fast, watching the faces around the table carefully. A couple of people shifted in their seats. One man stopped writing and looked at me for a long moment before continuing. Afterward, one of the older deputies pulled me aside. He didn't introduce himself, just stood close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. "You should be careful how you tell this story," he said quietly. "People around here don't like complications." "What does that mean?" I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Means they'll chalk it up to something simple, and that's that. For your own good, you might want to do the same." That was the closest anyone came to acknowledging that what happened didn't fit the explanation. In the weeks that followed, the site was quietly removed from our company's patrol list. The contract was terminated early. No explanation given. When I asked my supervisor about it, he told me it wasn't my concern and suggested I take some time off. His eyes slid away when I pressed him for details. I tried to go back to normal life. I really did. I went to the grocery store, filled my truck with gas, watched TV in the evenings. On the surface, everything looked the same. Inside, I was falling apart. Loud noises made me flinch. The smell of wet dog made my stomach churn. I stopped sleeping with the lights off. I stopped driving back roads at night, sticking to highways even if it added an hour to the trip. I quit the security job not long after, telling myself it was temporary. It wasn't. The nightmares didn't stop, but they changed. Instead of reliving the attack, I'd dream of standing in the woods alone, knowing something was watching me but refusing to show itself. I'd wake up just before it stepped into the light, heart hammering, sheets tangled around my legs. I started researching, quietly at first. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I typed in vague searches: large upright animal South Carolina, canine creature woods, unexplained attacks Francis Marion. I didn't expect much. What I found made my skin crawl. Stories from hunters, hikers, truck drivers. Different places, different years, but the same details kept coming up. Upright canine shapes. Yellow eyes. Intelligence. That same overwhelming feeling of being watched, studied. Some people called it a dogman. Others didn't give it a name at all, just described what they'd seen and how it had changed them. I wasn't alone. That realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant I wasn't losing my mind. Terrifying because it meant whatever killed Mark was real, and it wasn't unique to that patch of woods. One night, a few months later, I ran into a guy at a diner near McClellanville. He recognized me from the security job, asked how I was holding up. We talked for a bit, careful and polite. As he was leaving, he leaned in and lowered his voice. "People been hearing things out there again," he said. "Near where your buddy got taken. Sheriff says it's nothing, but folks are staying away." He gave me a look that said more than his words did, then walked out. I sat there for a long time after that, staring into a cup of coffee I didn't remember ordering. The guilt came back full force, heavy and crushing. I was still alive. Mark wasn't. And whatever did it was still out there, moving through the trees, watching and waiting. By the time I finally decided to talk about it openly, years had passed. The official story hadn't changed. Animal attack. Tragic but simple. But I knew better. And once you know something like that exists, really know it, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to believing the woods are just trees and animals and shadows. You start to understand that sometimes, the silence means something is listening. I waited a long time before deciding to tell this story the way I'm telling it now. Years, actually. Not because I thought people would laugh, though plenty probably will. I waited because saying it out loud makes it real again in a way I can't control. Writing it, speaking it, even thinking it through from beginning to end brings me right back to that clearing, to those eyes in the headlights, to the moment I realized I was going to live and Mark wasn't. My life doesn't look the same anymore. That's the simplest way to put it. I don't work nights. I don't take jobs that put me alone in remote places. I don't wander into the woods just to clear my head. I sold my house on the edge of town and moved somewhere with neighbors close enough that I can see lights in other windows at night. Some people would call that overreacting. I call it adapting. There are things I still can't do. I can't sit in silence without my thoughts turning on me. If the air gets damp and carries that wet, copper smell, my chest tightens before I even realize why. Sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I swear I hear that low, resonant sound again, not a growl exactly, just that vibration that feels like something large shifting its weight in the dark. Those nights, I don't bother trying to sleep. I sit up until the sun comes up, reminding myself I'm indoors, surrounded by walls and locks. Some people believe me. A few close friends do, mostly because they saw what I was like before and what I became after. They saw the weight loss, the way my hands shook when certain topics came up, the way I avoided certain roads without being asked. They don't need to hear every detail to know something broke inside me out there. Most people don't believe me. Or they believe a softened version of the story. They say it was a bear, or a pack of dogs, or that stress and darkness filled in the gaps my memory couldn't handle. I don't argue with them anymore. Arguing doesn't change anything, and it doesn't bring Mark back. But I know what I saw. I know the difference between fear and instinct. I know what it feels like to be afraid of something you don't understand, and I know what it feels like when every part of your body recognizes a predator before your mind catches up. That thing in the woods wasn't confused. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't lashing out. It was deliberate. That's the part people have the hardest time accepting. Animals attack for food, for defense, for territory. What we encountered felt like something else. It waited. It watched. It tested us. It chose its moment, and it chose its target. When it looked at me before dragging Mark away, there was no hesitation in its eyes. Just awareness. As if it knew exactly what it was doing and why. I've gone back and forth over the years about what to call it. Dogman is the word people use now, and it fits well enough, I guess. Upright. Canine. Intelligent. But the name doesn't really matter. Giving it a label doesn't make it safer or more understandable. All it does is make it easier to talk about. What matters is this: it exists. I don't think they're everywhere. I don't think they're hiding behind every tree or stalking every hiker. But I do think there are places they move through, places where the woods are thick and the human presence is thin. Places where silence falls too quickly and the animals know enough to leave. The area near that old substation outside the Francis Marion National Forest is one of those places. I've driven past it once since that night, in broad daylight, on my way somewhere else. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I glanced toward the tree line as I passed, half expecting to see movement, a shape too tall to be a person standing just inside the shade. I didn't see anything. That didn't comfort me. If you're listening to this and you spend time in rural South Carolina, especially near large stretches of forest or swamp, pay attention to the small things. When the woods go quiet all at once. When dogs stop barking mid-sound. When you smell something that doesn't belong, something thick and wrong that makes your stomach turn. When you feel that pressure, that sense of being watched even though you can't see anything. If that happens, don't investigate. Don't try to be brave. Don't tell yourself it's just your imagination and push deeper into the dark. Get out. I mean that. Leave immediately. Get to light, to people, to noise. Whatever pride or curiosity you think you have isn't worth testing against something that's already decided you're there. I still carry guilt. I probably always will. I replay that night and wonder if there was a moment, a single second, where a different choice would have changed the outcome. Maybe there was. Maybe there wasn't. That's something I'll never know, and it's something I have to live with. Mark deserves more than an animal attack in a report file. He deserves the truth, even if it makes people uncomfortable. Even if it makes them doubt me. This is my confession because it's the only thing I have left to give him. I survived. He didn't. And whatever took him is still out there, moving through the trees, patient and quiet, waiting for the next time the woods fall silent. If you ever find yourself in a place where that silence feels heavy and wrong, don't wait to understand it. Just go.